This tank chat is going to be about this vehicle, the American M60 tank, a tank that's now been in service in a number of armies around the world. 63 years it's been out there, and undoubtedly it's going to go on serving probably for decades to come.
This video has been made possible by our supporters on Patreon, our YouTube members and our super thanks donors. Please join them if you can and support the Tank Museum. And thanks for watching.
In this particular video, I'm going to really concentrate on its development and the American use of the M60, because otherwise, frankly, we'd be here all day, because it's one of those tanks that appears in so many theatres, so many militaries and so many conflicts post-World War II. So let's go back to that period first of all. End of the Second World War, inevitably the American military downsizes considerably. And what budget and what money there is tends to go to the nuclear program and the Air Force, with the idea of the strategic bomber, and the Navy with aircraft carriers to take nuclear weapons around the world. The Army doesn't get much of a slice of that US defense budget immediately post-World War II. And one of the things they're looking at their current holdings, they look at the M26, the Pershing tank, and they know they want to improve on that tank. So one of the few bits that they actually do to their tank fleet is they start a program to upgrade the M26 Pershing tank. Now, they add a new 90mm gun to it with a bore evacuator at the end of the barrel and a muzzle brake. They replace the engines on the M26, and really it's a conversion program that's going on. And that program is going on without great urgency behind it, because, as I mentioned, you know, the American military, they're really looking at that nuclear age. And in 1950, the Vannevar Bush, who was really the chief scientific advisor in World War II to Roosevelt, he's coming out saying the age of the tank's dead. Well, there's no need for tanks again in the future. The nature of warfare has changed. So you can see that sense of need for the tank is really being questioned, and it's being questioned in other countries as well for other reasons. For example, if you've got one person with a Panzerfaust or a bazooka, if they can take out a tank, big questioning going on with the future of the tank all round. June of 1950, Korean War changes all of that. All of a sudden, the Americans are realizing we've missed out here. Tanks are still going to be needed in certain types of warfare. And even with the terrain of Korea, actually all going to want tanks there. The Americans rush out some of their Chaffee tanks, some older Shermans go out to Korea, some of these M26s, and the newer versions, which the Americans are now going to call the M46, and they call it a Patton tank for the first time. This name that the Americans follow up from what the British did in World War II. We called American tanks after American Civil War generals. The US military decided to continue that tradition, but much more all-encompassing in terms of the names of the figures they're going to name these things after. So the first Patton is that M46 tank, which goes off and actually sees service in Korea. So the impact of that Korean War means the Americans push forward other tank designs. And one is almost an emergency measure: get a new turret, new gun, 90mm gun, put that on the proven hull of the M26, the Pershing tank in essence, put those together and get them produced quickly. And from 1951 to 1953, they make about 8,500 of this new model tank that they're going to be calling the M47. It's an improvement, but it's not that much of an improvement. And even as they're pushing that one forward as a yet another interim model in many ways, behind the scenes, they're doing developments that leads to the next generation of Patton tank. They're going to call all these tanks Patton tanks, the M48. The M48 actually seems to be much more considered. It's got many more newer features in there. But for many of us, again, if you actually look back at the period, one of the interesting things is this development in the early 1950s, almost as well, you might think there might be a Soviet influence in there, of these rounded shaped turrets. Now the Soviets go down, we often say the phrase upturned frying pan shaped turrets. With the Americans, it's like an upturned wok. It's slightly higher domed, thick armour it's got on it, but they like that ballistically rounded shape. And that goes on to the M48, which there's a pilot model as ready as early as 1951. They even order, because again, the Korean War at this time still going on, they're ordering that tank before the pilot models are even finished their trials, because again, with that American system of trying to use tried and tested components, putting those things together, they like the idea of getting something out there. And of course, as I mentioned, the Cold War is developing in Europe. These are tanks that are also going to reinforce the American forces in NATO, in Europe, and also be supplied to a number of NATO armies. And from that point of view, you've got about 8,500 of these tanks are actually made, which is a sizable number when you think of it in that immediate or just after that post-war period there. Now, whilst the M48 is going into development, a number of projects are going on in the USA which are starting to look at new technologies that could be used in the tank. And these take a number of different avenues. For the engines, they're looking at a new X-shaped engine as a way of pushing that forward. Diesel is being looked at as well to a new degree that the Americans weren't particularly interested in diesel-powered tanks in the Second World War. Actually, looking at the range a diesel engine tank can go compared to a petrol engine tanks, that onus seems to sort of go up the wants list, the agenda, the need for the American military. So they start a number of different projects. They start a smoothbore 90mm gun project. They like the idea of the smoothbore. In the background, they're already starting to look at the idea as well as missiles. Missiles might be a suitable weapon system for replacing a direct fire cannon or gun on a tank. Maybe missiles are the way to go. The problem we've got as well is with all these clever ideas, and some of them sound quite futuristic. You know, they're looking at silica armour, putting glass inserts into between sheets of steel, etc. This is all very well, but in terms of actually getting a grip on all these different projects to actually make an end result, Congress and the US Army starts getting worried that this is getting too dispersed, it's costing lots and lots of money. Are we really getting anywhere? And that's going to be a theme that we see in this post-war era, not just the 50s, but in the 60s and 70s as well. How do these projects start drifting off, or how do you get them back into a product that the military is going to want and need? So with these problems in mind, in 1957, the US military formed a committee. It's already Congress has been asking questions, but something called the Army Combat Vehicle or ARCOV Committee is formed in May of 57. And they look at these different projects and they look at what they think the military is going to really need. So one of the first things that comes out of this is the insistence that a future tank has got to have a diesel engine because of the fuel economy. There are fire issues as well. Diesel harder to actually set on fire than petrol, so there's a safety element there. In September of 1957, they actually clear the decks and start a new program to build a new tank to replace the M48. That's going to be called the M60 program, and some of these ARCOV findings or recommendations obviously go into that M60 program. So with the M60 program, they're going to look at what are they going to need in those different areas for the new tank. Back in 1956, a T-54 is driven into the British Embassy compound in the Hungarian uprising. Britain has a chance, a defence attaché, to measure the thickness of the armour on the front of that vehicle, and also there's a worry that that 100mm gun these tanks are carrying is going to penetrate the tanks we have in service. So that leads Britain to start that 105mm gun programme, which we see going on to the British Centurion tanks. It's a very, very good gun. The Americans are very much aware of that information, that our contemporary enemy, Korean War is over, actually we're back to looking at Europe and NATO. Those Soviet-built tanks are likely to be the ones we might be fighting against. So US military are very much aware of that and start that program. What are we going to look at for the M60 that's going to be a tank gun that can take on the latest Soviet vehicles? Now, they actually get 6 different guns together to do firing trials, mainly at Aberdeen Proving Ground, where they're looking there, what's going to be wanted. They look at the American-built 120mm gun that they've put on the M103, the last of their heavy tank programs. The M103 gets retired relatively early on, so but the gun is there. The US military quite likes that gun, but it's got a major problem. If you're now going to be building a medium weight tank, and that's the aim with the XM60 program, they like the idea, everyone's coagulating into the idea of we really need a main battle tank. It's moving on from that. Britain used to call it the universal tank. The Americans had had the heavy, the medium and the light. Early 1960s, that goes down to the main battle tank and maybe a light tank. So that main battle tank has to have the firepower that traditionally went on sometimes the heavier tanks like the M103. So that 120mm gun, even though some of the engineers, the ordnance people at Aberdeen, they really like it, they realise it ain't going to work in this turret of what's going to be the XM60 program because it's so big. And don't forget that 120 rounds that they're firing, it's got a projectile followed by the case with the propellant in. So the firing is about twice the time for the same rate of rounds coming out as it would be in the normal single piece ammunition in the normal size turret. So as they do these very different, look at 6 different guns, the one that comes out the best is in essence the British 105 gun. So again, with some American adaptations, the first tube, they're actually using British tubes till they can start making them in America. That's a gun that's chosen. And of course, when we look back in hindsight, what a sensible decision as well, because the range of ammunition types that end up getting built for the 105 guns, it becomes a NATO standard. Britain's using it. It goes on the M60, it then goes later on the Leopard 1 and various other vehicles as well. So that commonality of ammunition, the fact there's such a range of ammunition, and in sense of the quality of the actual gun, armour piercing, discarding sabot, there's nothing really that can beat it. And its accuracy is tremendously good as well. So from that point of view, that's the gun the Americans are going to want to put on their programme. So what about armour for this? They start by looking at this new fused silica armour in a sandwich. They like the idea, but production facilities for actually making this are limited. There's major issues in actually getting enough of that produced. So they start off by looking at a steel hull to build for this new programme that maybe could have applique armour packs on the front. And the difference, there's a lot of ideas they're taking with this XM60 program that are taking from the very successful M48 that of course is still in service at this time. One of those changes though is instead of having an elliptical front that's on the front of the glacé plate, they end up having a flat, straight front, and that you can actually see on the production versions of the M60. And that was done on purpose. So extra applique armour plaques, including this new silica armour, could be fitted on the front of the vehicle. In reality, because of production difficulties, those armour packs never ended up being made or issued to the troops. So that idea of the silica armour was dropped pretty early on in that XM60 programme. But it does seem you can see the residue of it on the front of the actual production M60 tanks. They end up doing it with steel homogeneous armour. Castings are made. There's a lot of castings on the M60, tremendous casting technology when you look at the turrets and certain parts of the hull that way. There's welding is going on between those different parts of the castings as well. On the frontal armour, about 6 inches, which with the angle there is equivalent for a horizontal around coming in, about 10 inches thick of steel armour protection you've ended up putting on there. So very impressive that way at the time of what was going to be the sort of the standard protection. And the aim is to protect this vehicle against that 100mm gun. And they've already got wind of a 120mm gun coming in the future from the Soviets as well. The turret, they look at 4 different castings. And part of those castings, one of them comes from a project that's been going on in the 1950s in the background, which is the idea of a tank that is going to be built called the T95 tank. It's taken a lot of those clever ideas that have been going on there. Now, all this new technology that the Americans are developing in the 1950s, people often look at this T95 program that's going to be the replacement for the M48 and see that as what if, what might have been, with all these clever ideas. But that fear that Congress had, that these ideas are going places as technologies that aren't mature enough, is this actually going to get on a vehicle, means that by 1960, the T95 program, however radical some of those ideas were, is stopped and canned by US Congress. But they actually take another one of those turrets from the experimental program, and that one ends up going on the first production M60s, but it's looked at in terms of it's a casting again, and they add almost, it looked like a mini turret if you look at the scale of it, but it's an M19 cupola that they put on the top for the commander. And that cupola can actually turn all the way round 360. It's powered. They put a 50 caliber machine gun in the earlier versions. Another model 50 caliber comes on a little bit later on, the M85 version of the 50 caliber. That can do a 360 turn, and the turret can be facing in a different direction. So again, the commander can be looking out for other targets, looking around the battlefield, whilst the gunner is engaging a target he's already identified for that gunner and that 105 gun. So that's one of these features of the M60, this very, very big turret. And on top of that, this quite large M19 cupola that's part of that whole program. March 1959, the way they're looking at these different things, it gets approved. Chrysler is given a contract to come up with about 45 test vehicles. That's a big fleet of vehicles that are going to be needed. And these early XM60 test vehicles, they're going to be around, they're ready from about July 1959. So that program in the 1950s leading up to the XM, or the M60 as we know it as it goes into production, has been in many ways a successful program. But really the tank that the Americans in so many areas had been wanting in the background had been a much more sophisticated vehicle. The American Army can't hang around. So the M60 goes into production, and we first start seeing those vehicles, production vehicles, early in the 1960s. So with this new vehicle that's going to go into service, we've got the American version of the 105mm gun. It'll carry about 57 rounds of 105 ammunition. Next to that gun, they do an M73. It's basically a shortened version of a Browning. And that 7.62, they carry about 2,000 rounds as a coaxial machine gun there as well. We're now getting into the age of rangefinders that are being fitted. So there's a coincidence rangefinder, mechanical linkage as well from being able to look at the rangefinder, and it's a mechanical computer. This is basically, it's almost working in the sense it's lined up with the gun. Range finding is such a problematic thing at this period because, of course, what you've got to be able to do if you're firing out to ranges around 2,000 meters, you really need to know that range because, again, from the angle of the barrel to make sure that that round's going to hit the target. So getting that distance right. And in the M60 production, range finding is changed till the very last models who are coming into the laser period, etc. They add during the production, late 1962, they add an infrared searchlight. So you'll see a lot of M60s with a huge searchlight. They try to put a box on to store that searchlight as well. Infrared, of course, which gives the capability of potentially firing at night to be able to see that, but it's not, it's an active system, so the enemy will be able to detect you if they've got detectors for infrared systems. So pluses and minuses that come with some of these systems there. They start by putting aluminium road wheels on the vehicle, trying to lessen the weight. And one of those very, very distinctive things you'll see about the M60 is the classic, what's called the boat-shaped hull. And again, looking back to the M48, they've taken that same idea forward. And the idea there, the rounded bottom, is when they go over a mine, it's so that that blast will be vented up the side and hopefully not captured underneath, which of course can mean if the vehicle turns over, you've got major, major problems there. So they follow that on. And in many areas, you'll hear people describe that the M60 is really just an improved M48. It has a number of much better features. It's a bigger tank all round. It comes in at about 50 tons, the M60, but it's one of those ones where, again, this phrase is coming out. They don't want to call the M60 a Patton, but inevitably everyone puts it into the Patton family. Product improved, they come out with all these different phraseologies for how this system develops on. But again, as I mentioned earlier on as well, the M60, as it's being built, in essence, it's a tank that the US military see as an interim model, because that project earlier on had much more sophisticated, ambitious aspirations on it. The M60 takes some of those, but not all of them. So this is seen as, in many ways, an interim model. And into the 1960s, one of the other things to remember as well, another replacement program gets going, this time MBT 70. That's going to take the role of the M60, but that program ends up falling apart. It's a joint program put forward, Robert McNamara, the American Defense Secretary, trying to sort of say, look, our commitment to NATO and the Europeans, let's work on a joint tank project. The Germans come forward, they put this idea together, but there's really then a falling out. It doesn't actually lead to a replacement tank for the M60. So why I mention that now is because the M60, as a model that might have lasted 10 years, has to soldier on in US service for much longer than expected, which is why there's a number of upgrades. And my description of an early M60, or what they're trying to put in there at the beginning, is very different to what comes out with the end of the program and the M60A3s with number of upgrades programs that are on there. Let's have a look at one or two of those bits and pieces that come on. The engine. So they've already said, the US military, we want a diesel engine. And what ends up going in there is a very powerful, it's about 750 horsepower. It's called the AVDS 17902A diesel engine. And that's put in there, and it's a big engine. And that's why, again, if you look at the rear of an M60, there's something about the scale of this vehicle. When you're looking at those earlier family members of the Patton 47, 48 tanks, M60 suddenly jumps at you in terms of it really is a very big tank. It gets to become a very high tank, over 10 foot tall. And that, again, with that other mini cupola there, again, when the Russians are trying to go the other way, they get rid of their loader, they're making their tanks a much lower profile to hit. Almost seems in the 60s with the M60, the Americans have gone in a different direction. They've made a higher tank, a bigger tank that way, and that's very noticeable. They take the track off the M48. It's called the T97, the E2 version. Later on in the 70s, they come up with a newer version that you can put the rubber track pads, replaceable rubber track pads in. And again, that's a NATO standard procedure because we don't want to be ripping up the roads in most of Europe. So from that side of things, rubber track pads, you're pretty much certain it's going to be a NATO-inspired tank. They give it full NBC equipment because, again, this is their thinking. It might well have to fight on the nuclear battlefield, and that means you've got an overpressure system. They're filtering the air and they're pumping that air pressure inside the vehicle is higher, so air will only leak out and nothing should come in. So that NBC system is put into all the M60 tanks. And they're also looking as well from the point of view suspension. The early models only have one shock absorber on the torsion bar suspension systems, and that's normally at the front. Again, we'll see as they improve the tank, they end up putting two shock absorbers in there. Drive at the rear, drive sprocket. So when you look at this, in many ways, it's a traditional US tank layout. We're down to 4 men. The M48, first time they've got rid of the co-driver's position. Again, the driver is now central in that hull, and you've got a commander up in that mini turret. You've got a loader and a gunner in the turret as well. Driver on his own down at the front. And this also is the last American tank they put into production where they give that driver an escaper hatch underneath the vehicle. And the whole point there, of course, is if the tank is knocked out in combat with the gun over his hatch, he's got a different way of being able to exit the vehicle. In 1960, even as the first models of the M60 are starting to be produced, they're already realizing we can improve on that particular vehicle in quite a number of different areas. So the M60A1 ends up being very quickly after the early model M60s putting into production. And what's there? They get a pilot model for the A1 in the summer of 1961. It goes into production properly the following year. They're thickening the armour, again because of that Soviet threat, with a 115mm gun. They improve on the turret ballistics, and again they go back to that T95 project and actually get one of the turrets that was being tested for that, the E7 model. It's got a narrower frontage and therefore a better ballistic shape for if rounds are coming at it. And they decide, and that's the T60 most of us, type of turret that most of us are familiar with, that much more narrow frontage on there. And again, it's got thicker protection on the front, but also it's got a larger bustle, so more rounds can be actually stored in the back of the turret, which again helps the vehicle. Second shock absorber is put on the front because that newer turret is slightly heavier. It needs a bit more strength in the suspension system there. Better seats. The original wire seats, actually they take those out, give them some padding. Vehicle control, we're now onto a T-bar steering system on the M60A1, and you'll see better electronics. And this program, as it were, is almost, so the M60A1 is the first of those major programs. Actually, improvements, because the vehicle has to soldier on for such a long time, improvements continue quite a bit. And that's because, again, don't forget this MB60, or MB70 rather, replacement tank takes a lot of time. So with the MBT70 program being cancelled and US Congress looking at this, the problems with that particular program, that idea that the M60 will have to soldier on through the 1970s, that means this, from the A1, very early improvements, but these improvements has to continue. So upgrades, there's a series of upgrades that go on with the tank, and they get to a point that in 1975, pretty much all the tanks are sent back over a period of time to go through what becomes known as the RISE program. And that's Reliability Improved Selected Equipment. That's what that RISE stands for. And they're really upgrading everything, trying to upgrade things to the same standards. They've already improved the air cleaners. They've tried to fit a gun stabilization system that is on the horizontal and also the vertical planes. It does mean for the first time, if you're clever at using this, you can fire an M60 on the move, which of course another number of European countries, Britain with the Chieftain, Germans later with Leopard 2, have got on their tanks there. So that's something that they really think they want, because if it works properly, and on some of the gunnery trials, they've got a 70% chance of a first round hit out to 2,000 meters, and that's quite something if you can do that. And of course, if you can fire on the move, you're less of a target, or you're a harder target for the enemy to hit back at you. These things are going on. New T142 track is added to the vehicle. They improve the engine. The AVDS becomes 17902C diesel engine, so that gets a little bit more power in there. Reliability issues, etc. that way. They put new wire harness inside the vehicles. They add the British, in 1978, they add those British smoke discharges, are very familiar if you look on Chieftain tanks, they're added to the vehicle. And because of information coming from other sources, they end up building and seeing the success with the Israelis and their Blazer armoured ERA, as explosive reactive armour. The Americans build sets of that armour to go on the M60s. They're improving this vehicle quite a number of times. Now, I'm going to jump back just a moment, because there's another version of the M60 that we often see. We don't see that much of because it wasn't in service for that long. But there was a big debate back to as well, looking at that T95 program, early 1960s as well. They're all looking at the idea as the missile taking over from the direct fire high velocity gun. And that missile system, the Americans invest quite a bit of money into looking at what might be better to fit on a tank. Because basically a tank gun, maybe about 2,000 meters at this sort of time, a missile can go 4,000 or even 6,000 meters. And they were getting a 90% first round kill with some of these missiles out to 4 kilometers. These are stats that the American military are bound to be looking at, thinking, hang on, that's something we could really do with here. So they start a program, August 1961, of a new type of gun. They're calling this basically a gun launcher because it's going to do two things. It's a tube that you can launch a missile from, but you can also fire high explosive anti-tank rounds. So again, from the Americans' point of view, that put on an M60, they think is going to be a good idea, and they trial 3 different types of turrets before they come up again with this idea. What are we going to put this new gun on, and will it actually work on an M60? So the turret they choose is actually one that has 40% less frontage to aim at. So you think that's a rather good idea. The trouble is it tends to be negated because they put the commander at the back and again in a fairly large extra dome shaped at the rear of that turret. But you've got the commander at the rear, gunner on one side, loader on the other side, and they're using what becomes a Shillelagh missile system. They call that it's a 152 millimeter launch tube. But if you follow the Shillelagh story, it's very problematic. It's a gun they're going to put on a light air portable tank called the Sheridan, or launcher they're going to put on that. It has major problems. They accept it for the M60, and in 1973 they start production of what becomes the M60 A2 model, and that's got this new smaller turret, that launcher on it. But it needs a lot of extra electronics put in because of this new launch system, the way it's tracked, because when there's an initial charge that fires a missile out the 152 millimeter tube, then solid rocket fuels kick in, that projects the missile further forward, but what's got to be done is on an infrared beam and guided by the gunner to the target. The tank has to be stationary while that's going on. And there's a number of problems that come with that system. Early on, they have a locking key on the missile that fits into a groove in that launch tube. That's causing cracks in the barrels. So there's problems there. And they don't really like it as well because there's lots of misfires, lots of failures, very complex vehicle to keep going. And you've got to remain stationary whilst that missile travels towards the target and is relatively slow in getting there. So that in itself is going to be a problem for the crews on the battlefield. They only make about 540 of these A2 versions. They're not in service that long. They're actually phased out in 1981. And they become another one of those stories where the technology sounds good, too complex to maintain. It's got vacuum tubes in it. It's got lots of things going wrong. They nicknamed sometimes these vehicles starships just because of the amount of electronics that was going in there that was going to be needed. But a great technology in one sense, but if it doesn't actually work for the guys on the ground, no use to anyone at all. So those tanks, the A2 model, have phased out relatively quickly. So with the RISE program, it's not the end, I'm afraid to say, of those improvements that are going on the M60. That carries on even after RISE. There's something called RISE Passive as well. New electronics, new fire control systems. The whole point here is the Americans in the 1970s have realised we haven't got that NBT-70. Congress has already got mad with the military at the end of the 60s, early 70s. They finally end up finding more money for a new program than the previous program, and that new program, of course, leads to the Abrams tank. But M60 is a tank that's got to soldier on to the early 1980s where Abrams starts being issued. So there's even further upgrades on the M60 A3 model that comes in. What we end up doing, new fire control, halon, a fire suppressant system is put in the vehicles. Again, so if you are penetrated, there's a way of trying to put these out. Passive, early sighting systems and early passive sighting, then a thermal sight, an active thermal, really important from the point of view because this is then giving the crews the chances of seriously fighting at night. And those systems are back retrofitted on most of the M60 A3 fleet. So it goes into service and is still remaining in service because even as the Abrams starts appearing, it's going to take time before the whole of the US tank fleet can be replaced, and we're still looking at the height of the Cold War here. So by 1986, you're getting to the last of the official US upgrades and orders going to the factories. Meanwhile, in the background, the US has been selling or passing on M60s to lots of other countries around the world. One of the last orders is 86, goes out to Egypt. So a whole load of tanks are going there. But that's really it, really, from the point of view of the new production. Of course, it's not it from the point of view of upgrades, because those upgrades continue not for American forces, but they continue for forces around the world still using the M60 tank. Now, I've talked about the US use of the M60 and its development. Of course, this is a tank that is still being used. Egypt, Turkey, both have huge fleets of these tanks, as smaller numbers around the rest of the world, which means that there's still companies are making upgrade programs. Lots of things are being done for this. And we were very fortunate because when we bumped into some guys from Horstman, they mainly we've been talking to them about things such as suspension systems, etc. But they're also part of a project that is continuing to make engines for the M60. And for us, that's really important because one of our M60s, we're very fortunate here, we have two M60s, both of them gifted from US military stocks. One of them has got a really poorly engine. So what we were able to do with Horstman's, and thank you so much, they've been supplying us with a new engine. So watch this space. We're going to be putting a new engine in one of our M60s, and hopefully you'll have the pleasure of seeing and the privilege of seeing that running around here in the future. On the whole, the Americans, when it's being exported, it's what they call the EA model when it's going around the place, or the E60 model when it goes for foreign sales. The tank has seen action in US service, but not much. It's already being passed on to the Marines for the first Gulf War. So back in 1991 with Desert War, you're going to see M60s being used by the US Marines in conflict. But actually, they're already starting to think at the end of that Gulf War, they're going to start phasing them out. They're still in service with the US National Guard till about 1997. And some still go work for the US military because they end up becoming op forces or training aids, etc. So some do actually see service into the early 2000s as well. It sees a lot of action in other military service. 1973, Yom Kippur War, with the Israelis. It's a really important tank for them. They add era armour places on it, blazer reactive armour. They've got that tank in service quite a number of years, and it sees quite a bit of combat. It sees combat, it's still in combat, Yemen today. So this idea for the American military, it may have been a stopgap tank, but actually it's a tank that has seen a lot of action. It's also one of those tanks as well where you sometimes, you can look at this in two different ways. Was it a complete waste of money for the US taxpayers, or did it actually do its job? Which is the vast majority of M60s, of course, they didn't go to Vietnam, they went to Europe, they sat there as part of NATO all that period. And the counter-argument was it a complete waste because it didn't do its stuff? It wasn't necessarily the best tank in Europe either, but the Cold War did not become a hot war. So one of those judgments you might say about this tank, it really did do its job, as were the crews, because they sat there all through those long decades of the Cold War, ready to fight, but luckily that situation never occurred. And if you look at it historically, the Cold War does not become that hot war, but the West wins it. And from that point of view, that M60 tank as part of that certainly did its job.